On September 10, 1991, during his fourth court appearance, Jeff Dahmer changed his plea from not guilty to guilty but insane. Now, there was no need to prove guilt, together with the constitutional rights given up in the previous hearing. Instead, there would be an insanity trial to determine whether Jeff Dahmer would spend the rest of his life in prison or a mental institution. A few months later, on January 13, 1992, there was a motion hearing. If you want to understand how we know this trial was phony, it's essential to understand what happened during that motion hearing. So, what is a motion hearing? A motion is a written request or proposal to the court to obtain an asked-for order, ruling, or direction. In other words, you're asking the court for something. For example, when you become involved in a lawsuit, you may want the court to agree to something outside of the normal litigation process. What was the purpose of the January 13th motion hearing before Jeff Dahmer's trial? Well, a number of motions were actually put forward by defense attorney Gerald Boyle, including how the jury was going to be selected and the trial's location. Gerald Boyle also made a request to withdraw 2 motions. These are the 2 we need to look at carefully. Gerald Boyle requested to withdraw a motion to suppress physical evidence. This was about the confession. Now, the confession was considered physical evidence because it had been signed by Jeff Dahmer. In other words, Gerald Boyle wanted to admit the confession as physical evidence. Now, remember that Gerald Boyle recommended that the alleged physical evidence be returned to the families just 2 weeks after Jeff Dahmer was arrested. That violated a Wisconsin statute about the disposal of evidence. See Part 1 of this series for more information about that. In other words, Jeff Dahmer's lawyer, Gerald Boyle, wanted to 1. Admit the confession as evidence, and 2. Be able to make statements to the media about the case. These requests were approved. Gerald Boyle could now admit the confession, which contained another man's social security number, as evidence, and he could make statements to the media. You can watch the televised 1992 motion hearing here. Gerald Boyle speaks quickly using legal jargon, however, YouTube gives you the option to read the transcript. But why was there a motion to suppress the confession to begin with? Well, there was a motion to suppress the confession because there was a concern about admitting the confession as evidence due to a legal technicality. That legal technicality was this: the confession followed an element of unlawful activity by police, the illegal search we discussed in the first video. In his argument to admit the confession, Gerald Boyle quoted previous legislation. The decision made by the Supreme Court in Brown v. Illinois is the following. In other words, statements made after the arrest in this case were admissible despite the unlawful invasion because 1. The petitioner had been given the Miranda warnings, and 2. The petitioner wasn't coerced into making the statements. In the motion hearing, Gerald Boyle points out that Jeff Dahmer had been given the Miranda warnings and that he had given up his constitutional rights. Why was Gerald Boyle so eager to admit the confession? Gerald Boyle argued that the confession should be admitted because the actual physical evidence was, quote, incredibly revolting. In other words, Gerald Boyle didn't want to present any physical evidence. Did they have any physical evidence? To sum up, Boyle is arguing that other types of physical evidence aren't necessary since they have the confession. Boyle cites Brown v. Illinois to argue that the confession can be used. See the description for links to information about Miranda rights and the concept of attenuation. Gerald Boyle wanted to use the confession only, even though the point of the defense was to prove that Jeff Dahmer was insane. Wouldn't bringing in actual physical evidence have made it easier to prove Jeff Dahmer was insane? Was Gerald Boyle actually trying to prove Jeff Dahmer was insane? Why was Gerald Boyle so eager to dispose of the physical evidence? If Gerald Boyle was trying to prove Jeff Dahmer insane, Why didn't he call Lionel Dahmer to testify? After all, Lionel Dahmer supposedly wrote a book detailing Jeff's descent into madness. The video of the January 13, 1992 motion hearing later confirms that Jeff Dahmer had signed 15 guilty pleas. When he did that, he gave up his right to have those charges proven. Here's an excerpt of the transcript from this televised motion hearing video. We asked the court for a copy of those signed guilty pleas. Here's the response we received. Here's our original request to see the signed guilty pleas. As we've noted, Jeff was not found guilty at trial since he waived all his constitutional rights to a fair trial to prove guilt. It was only ever about trying to prove insanity. The video of the motion hearing clearly states that Jeff Dahmer signed 15 guilty pleas. The court says they don't exist. Previously discussed in an earlier video, Jeff Dahmer had already given up his right to a preliminary hearing, the first stage in the process to prove guilt. This is why the many anomalies in the confession were not in question. The case was to prove insanity only, not to prove guilt. If the trial had followed the traditional route, the case might have been dropped on a technicality. If the confession had been properly cross-examined at a preliminary hearing, the fact that it contained things like another man's social security number would have been revealed. Again, was Gerald Boyle defending Jeff Dahmer or not? What exactly was Gerald Boyle doing?